Okay, 195 Leute sind drin. Ich glaube, wir können loslegen. Ja, dann,
Okay, we have 195 people here. I think we're ready to get started. So, Andreas, thank you very much for being here today and for taking the time to tell us a little bit about how you monitor Microsoft Azure and also just telling us from your real-life experience, because this is a pretty new topic for us supporting it. Supporting all the cloud monitoring services, etc. So let's get started. Everybody else, please enjoy. I'm going to enjoy it myself as well. I'm very curious to hear what you have to say. Hi, everybody. My name is Andreas Döhler, and today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience in regards to monitoring Azure. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself. I work at Bechtle, which is one of the smaller IT system companies in Germany. We have about 11,500 employees at the moment. And I myself am based in the Dresden-Chemnitz-Cottbus region. And that's a pretty big region. So, yeah, that's where I am. And Checkmk as a whole idea is something I think that I found about 10 years ago, basically. So I've been dealing with it for a long time. Matthias is also responsible for it when he first introduced it in Nuremberg. That's when I heard about it for the very first time. That was at the monitoring conference. And ever since then, this is my tool of choice when it comes to monitoring. Was that the legendary event where I met Lars? I'm not sure. You were actually there with a colleague from Wacker. Ah, that was Heinz. Yes, you were there with Heinz, and the two of you actually told us about how you were founded. Oh, yeah, I think that's where I met Lars. Yeah, and ever since then, this has been my tool of choice. Linux is something I've used for longer, but not full-time, since our clients mainly also use Windows, etc. So Linux was always sort of around, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't actually build our monitoring on that. And most people who know my name probably know it because of the forum, because I usually write 1 to 2 contributions every month. So now, talking about today's topic. Since we actually do more in the environment, where we also have cloud first, and we also try to always make it where the infrastructure is sort of from cloud ready to cloud only. And of course, a lot of things have changed. So there came a point where we had our first client who actually has their whole computing system in the cloud now. And the client is a medium-sized company, and they are active all over Europe. And that's why it did make sense for them to actually have their computing center in the cloud, because they have locations all over Europe, and every location they don't have a lot of people in any of the locations, and that's why all the infrastructures were quite difficult. So it may not be worth having all the different infrastructures for just a few people working in some locations. So in their case, they decided to go with Azure as their cloud system. And for us, we then first were wondering, okay, how are we going to integrate that into monitoring? And in order to do that, we then had a choice. So either having a virtual appliance in Azure, so just a Checkmk virtual appliance, or having the Checkmk in Azure on just regular VM. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both of them. And when it comes to the appliance, the positives are that you really don't have to look into the operating system, because everything is then included in the appliance. The deployment is usually very easy, and I am definitely emphasizing the word usually. And another big benefit would be the HA possibility. So, for example, if you have an appliance that works in Azure, you can have a second standby, and the second appliance that's on standby, then if there was a problem, it could be activated. However, I also have to mention that if in Azure a machine is no longer available, then usually more is broken than just this one machine. Usually you just have big interruptions with the whole computing center, etc. And then it's always very questionable whether or not it's going to work. But we're going to be able to see in just a second that we, like I said, appliance would have been the ideal case, but of course there were some problems when it came to the deployment. But the very first deployment of the appliance into Azure just happened the way we were used to, as you've seen it on-premise in a virtualization environment. The first problem where we were stopped or interrupted was that we didn't receive any information to the screen. The reason was that in a VM that is booting in the Azure and doesn't install any extra tools or doesn't have any extra tools or RTP services that are available, it only offers a serial console in Azure. And the problem with that is that it's a true serial console as we know it from using switches. Okay, so there's not a monitor screen. It does exist, but the only thing is a telnet output of a serial console. And that means that if I have a serial console and I have 9,600 location, as you're used to on a switch, then you are going to get an output. That was the first point in time where we decided to go with the appliance in the Azure environment, but we thought we're going to be clever, and we can also have machines and deploy them directly into Azure. So that means that we have the virtual appliance in the Hyper-V environment first, and we are then going to deploy the configured machine directly into Azure. So yes, that is possible, and that was sort of one step further, because within the Hyper-V environment, we were able to then also do the configuration of the hard drive of the virtual machine. And what wasn't possible, however, was just pre-configuring the network. So without actually then finding a different network in Azure, etc. So because of that, we then actually tried it once or twice to have this pre-configured machine and then still get that into the cloud. But we then decided, based on the complexity and also the time that would have to be invested, to sort of discontinue. And this is what the difference looks like as an example. This is the virtual console and the console as it would be with Telnet. If you had this Telnet menu, you could actually also deploy the virtual machine. However, that's a different topic, I think. Whether or not this is going to be making sense in terms of using it. Anyways, we then said, since all of this is too time-consuming and also is making it where it's quite costly, in Azure there's also a possibility to just deploy Linux machines and then actually just have a Checkmk Enterprise Edition on there. And to be honest, you have to say that Linux machine deployment within Azure is very, very easy and very straightforward. And that's why I would say it's 2 clicks, IP address, name, and the machine is actually running within 2 to 3 minutes. So it's deployed in that short period of time. Which version is that? Well, as of right now, you can actually select quite a few. So in the past, I think when we did it, it was just the Ubuntu 18.4, but I think it's also CentOS and Debian. So in the selection was sort of like a list of possibilities, basically. So all of the common big distributors are in there. What's really nice about that is that in the deployment, as we know, you only need your name, IP address, and everything is happening automatically. So you really don't have to configure anything manually. So once it's done, you have a completely configured machine with all the different tools, with all the tools that you need for Azure so that the integration can happen. And that is really nice. The only thing that you have to pay attention to, and you would have done that as well when you deployed with a pre-configured machine, you're going to have to decide what kind of size the machine has or what that looks like. And Of course, the cost of the monitoring system per month depends on that. Okay, so you have to determine that in the beginning. Well, you can also then do it later on. You can also change the machines later on, but you're going to have to get started with something, right? Where you can say, okay, how big do I want my machine to be? And also how much do I have in terms of monthly costs? One thing that is quite nice in Azure in comparison to the on-premise installation, so on-premise monitoring, is the following. You don't have as much of the services, as many of the services. So in our regular standard monitoring, we have about 30 to 40 services per host. And in Azure, it's 20 tops. Probably more likely like 10 to 20 per host. And of course, in terms of sizing, that's nice because of the Checkmk license. But in addition to that, it's also just as interesting for determining the size of the machine, because if I have less services, I'm going to need less space for graph data, etc. And usually for a setup like that, the smallest 2-core machine would be fine. In this case, we decided to go with a 4-core machine because we also needed another point covered. On the server, we have a graphic interface because, and I'm going to tell you about that later, it was also about the whole topic of how can we actually do application testing that makes sense. And in order to do that, we probably need something like a browser, but I'm going to tell you more about that later on today. So another thing that is something it took some time to get used to in Azure, but I think it's the same for all of the cloud providers. Usually when it comes to the sizes, if you have a number of CPUs, for example, you automatically also are told how much hard drive a machine has, etc. So it's bundled? Yes, it's bundled. So at the end of the day, I say I want 4 cores, and they're telling you, okay, you're going to use 4 cores. So 8 gigabytes, main memory, and 32 hard drive, for example. In our case, that's also very interesting. What kind of hard drives are actually there in the background? Is it SSD or what is it really? Could also be tapes, so because there's also offline memory and things like that, so then you just have specific sizes. So you can't take it too strictly what you see on the slides. You just always have to decide what you need for your own environment. Okay, so now some of you are probably wondering what is going to happen with everything that used to be network before. So we decided, since the network is not going to be virtualized, obviously, and it's still going to be running on-premise, so we decided that for network monitoring of the bigger locations, we are going to then use Checkmk instances that are just going to be on the premises. Okay, and they're implemented with everything else. Yeah, they're just going to be connected via live status, as we're used to, as we always do in distributed monitoring, because the machine in Azure is doing exactly the same as the other machine. And the idea behind that is that from Azure, we actually don't get to the local infrastructures. And that's why, really getting out of the cloud, you can't get back to your on-premise environment. And of course, there's sometimes a situation where it could make sense. For example, if you have hybrid infrastructures where you have on-premise servers and also cloud servers, and they have to communicate, then sometimes you also have site-to-site VPN connections, and in that case you can also just exchange data. But since we have an Azure-only environment here without any external servers, we really didn't need the site-to-site VPN connection. And network monitoring happens still exactly the same as we're used to, with a Checkmk instance in a normal situation. So it's a small PC in this case, and it's just small miniature PCs, and they're sort of like a monitoring appliance. Okay, and another thing that you can't forget about, even if you actually monitor it from the cloud, it's also a matter of cost, because traffic is not free of charge in any direction or in every direction. So always keep that in mind. Traffic is something that you have to pay for in one direction. Usually it's one direction that's for free and the other direction you have to pay for. Okay, but you may have the benefit of distributed monitoring in Checkmk because there's no traffic being created. Well, monitoring traffic is quite high in environments like that. Yeah, but if you have the site working locally in the network, yes, correct. That's why we do have that local network, yes. So I also see that in the chat from the cloud going out that you have to pay for. That's the problem. And that is what I was talking about earlier. And if I, for example, now actually I don't know, have to monitor infrastructure from the cloud, then you're going to have the cost problem most of the time. And that's why you just have to differentiate between the two and separate them, and then you're all good. Now we're going to cover the topic monitoring in Azure and what am I going to do with my instance in Azure. Okay, so one thing that we had to get used to, one thing that was also new to me, since this was the first Azure monitoring instance that I was actually in charge of, is really how are the services acting that used to be in the on-premise environment? What are they going to do in the cloud now? How do they pop up? And the first thing you notice is that normal database servers in Azure, they're just a database instance where you don't have a server anymore, but you only have a database as a virtual object. Load balancer, the same. So just the load balancer that you're used to. Then there's also only going to be a load balancing service. The only thing that's quite similar are application servers, because in my client's case, they are now just VMs within Azure. So with all their applications. One specialty that I forgot to mention is the next one. So all of these individual parts are then going to be gathered as resource groups, and resource groups are what we're going to see in just a second. So those are our Azure special agents that are addressing all of that, because this is exactly the basis where the special Azure agent is working on. It's asking all the resource groups that you are determining, and it then actually gives out all the data that he can get for every resource group. I would always, when it comes to monitoring Azure, I'd always try to get started with an individual or two resource groups in order to test if the whole setup works. And that is exactly what I've done in this case as well. I started with a simple resource group in order to do that, and we knew exactly what's contained in this resource group. We also knew what we expected as an output, and the results that we received, we just sort of checked them with the existing Azure dashboard in order to figure out if the results are actually in line with what we're seeing in the Azure dashboard. Another thing that we have noticed while doing that was the very first thing, and it didn't really matter, but in the current Azure Special Agent, there are not all the resources available that are available in Azure. That was also a topic during the last conference, if I remember correctly, where Moritz actually introduced what the Azure Special Agent can do, and that is okay. But one thing that is really nice about the resources that you're getting back from the special agent is that you see everything that it found, even if it doesn't have any specific data in regards to that. And you can think about that. You can think about if extra checks would be necessary, or if you think that it's sufficient, whatever you're seeing. And that's why I would say again, most of the data that you do need is going to be there. Other than that, the Linux and Windows machines that are in Azure are going to be monitored the same way they were in the on-premise world. So that means just with agents on the individual machines, and also by using the agent the same way it was before. So now, before we talk about the individual machines, or before we actually talk about all the individual services and what you see, there is one thing that I would like to tell you about Linux and also the machines. You always have to be very careful that within an Azure environment, firewalling is a pretty big topic. Usually, you really have the individual resource groups or the individual machines, and you really can't access that easily. So in this case, we had a big benefit in this environment, because before I actually deployed Checkmk, I actually used a different monitoring system, and I just used the ports that the other monitoring system was using. They were configured on all the different firewalls, so I just recycled that, and our Checkmk agent was then on port 11,050 or something like that. So we just had it run on there in order to not to have to configure everything again in terms of the firewall, because that can definitely be difficult in a cloud environment. That can be a very, very complex topic if you actually have to write new firewall rules for every resource groups, etc. Okay, there is a question in the chat. Which monitoring is 11,050 using? I have no idea what it was, but the colleagues then actually had a test environment where they apparently could also just use a port, and they then just use a high port. So just anything. And I think that is definitely something that was just made up. So it was just something that was more than 10,000 that they were using. That's all I was trying to say. Whether or not that makes sense, I don't know. Okay, now just quickly about what we are doing in our environment, what you can see here, and what was monitored. So let's get started with data points in Azure. So as you can see here, in comparison to an Oracle database or an MS SQL database, it's not a lot. That's it, right? That's all you get in terms of sort of values or numbers. And whether or not that is sufficient, I don't know. I'm not a database professional. But to me, what's relevant is CPU or deadlocks, and that is okay. Or also the number of connections in the database. Those are things that I need. And I'm not a specialist when it comes to databases, like I said, so the only things that are a little bit Azure specific when it comes to these checks are the storage indications. They don't give you anything like the size, as you know that from the on-premise environment, but instead this is the storage usage, I think, if I remember correctly. So on the directed storage for the database in percent. So how much of that storage was used. So you definitely have to get used to it. You have to get used to not actually having very specific information as you would in on-premise setups. It's definitely less. You can also see that here if you look at the storage account. So I'm just being told how much input and output I have in my storage and how much transactions. So you can also see the storage account in Azure. It doesn't have anything to do with just the file storage, but it really is just the block storage. And another thing that you see here, and you may have to do that with a check, because I was worried in the beginning because I just looked at the agent and I thought that the numbers are latencies of 700,000 or 500,000, but in reality, it's just 1/100th of a millisecond. And we have numbers of 5,700 milliseconds and 7,000 milliseconds. And that is definitely a value that is okay. So it's just a conversion problem, I think, of the API data, and it's not a real problem. And if you now look into the story, what's good about it, what's bad about it, you're going to notice that in the cloud, some things work differently as they do in on-premise environments. Because if you look at the description, you're told that as long as the numbers are similar, everything's okay. If they really don't deviate very much, both latencies, then it's fine. Of course, for somebody who just knows 1 or 2 milliseconds when it comes to storages and you're used to that, that's not very nice to hear. It's very difficult to grasp, I think. The next point that is not very present in our environment is just pure monitoring in Azure. So that would be something like site-to-site connections or point-to-point connections. And in our environment, we really only have web services in terms of the network in the cloud. And I do think that the results in terms of the output, they speak for themselves, right? So it's just really really the CPU utilization and also errors and response time. So this is sort of what you know from normal web service checks. Okay, then the next point, that is what everybody should be familiar with, regardless of if you've actually done cloud monitoring or not. Those are just the points that we really see in our host environment or server environment. This is what we determine, regardless if it's Windows or Linux. In Azure, depending on the agents you're using, it looks identical. And one of the most important points is really how is it different in comparison to VMware. That's the virtual machine. The virtual machines, I don't see them on the basis of well, I do have my virtual center. I see all the different machines in my virtual center. In Azure, I always see my virtual machines per resource group. So, of course, those would be a lot of individual checks. However, if you want an overview of your resource groups, it's very straightforward. And another thing that was new to me as well was just the status indication of the virtual machine. So in this case, for example, we just see the VM as running. Another thing I see, if VM is turned off, then it's not necessarily offline or off, but instead it could also be in a state, I think it's decommissioned in Azure, that's what it's called. So it's just a state where the machine is in standby. And it is also not occurring any costs because, of course, that is what is relevant. So it's definitely possible that some machines are turned off in order to save costs or if they're not used necessarily. So it would be similar to containers that are just sort of alive for a specific time period and then they're gone again. So the challenges when it comes to this whole thing is mainly just the behavior of the Azure API itself. The Azure API itself is unique because for some requested values, you don't get any output, in some cases at least, and there's also no error message coming back. So it's just an empty output that you're getting back. And if a minute later you're then requesting again, you just get the output again. And that's also the point where Moritz from Tribe 29 actually contributed a lot, finding a solution. And in our case, this is the solution for things like that. So the services are then stale. And we then see in monitoring if a service is stale and it's in stale for too long, then you're going to have to respond just as much as if a service actually gives you an error message. So, of course, there's a drawback on a stale service. You can actually not send out any notifications, but for that, you actually have your people in operations, right? And they have to keep an eye on monitoring, and they will see if the number of stale services is actually increasing, then they know that somebody's going to have to check and figure out what the problem is. For somebody such as myself, who actually didn't deal with Azure a lot, it was quite a big challenge to really understand the complex infrastructures at first. So how everything's organized, basically, and also just sort of getting a feeling for what individual resources are, what resource groups are, and how everything is working together. One more thing that can't be monitored right now, and the resources that can't be monitored, where we thought, okay, this would be nice to have if it was possible, are mainly load balancers, because in my setup, they are actually present in almost every resource group, and because of that, they are being used quite a bit. Currently, what we're doing is we just are actually treating them like web services, the load balancers, and we just use checks for the load balancers and just make sure if the services behind it are responding. Of course, we don't get any information in regards to whether or not a load balancer is working properly, but we can see if the services are available or not. And one more thing that worried me in the beginning were the API limits in Azure, but it turned out that that really wasn't a problem at all. And even with 40 resource groups, at the end of the day, we really don't have any problems with the API limits that Azure has given us. And the environment could have been 10 times the size that it was without ever having any problems with the API limits. Ooh, that's great. Yeah, so that was just my experience, right? And yeah, that just happened with our HTTP checks. One more thing that happened in Azure that is Microsoft specific, and in the beginning I had to find a solution for that as well, is just BizTalk, which is a buzzword, because everything that is Microsoft Dynamics and everything that is their own software and is sort of communicating with each other, that's almost all BizTalk. And for that, we just had our own plugins that were developed that work like they would in an on-premise environment. And yeah, they just go to the BizTalk servers and then they get all the queues with the status, etc. And they then just show that as we're used to. Okay, and now just very briefly, because I can see that we're almost out of time already, I'm just going to tell you very briefly about the problem that's still unresolved, and that is something that is quite a big problem in cloud monitoring. It's a problem that we have a lot of devices or a lot of instances there that can only be looked at as black boxes because you don't have any access to the resources or instances. And in that situation, in a cloud environment, in my opinion, you actually have to have end-to-end monitoring just to really be able to make proper statements in regards to, is a service that a customer is using in the cloud from a different cloud provider, is that even available, right? Because that is also something that I've noticed in this Azure environment as well. A lot of services that the client is actually using in their own system aren't even something that they own, but they're just cloud instances that other companies are making available. So you really don't have any access to that. Also, no information that you can get about it, etc. And so far, my first approach was that we have active end-to-end testing on the basis of Sakuli. And I then, after just a couple problems, I decided not to do that. And what we're doing currently is we are using a container with Chrome, so just a Docker container with Chrome. And we also have a Selenium web driver that's installed in the Selenium API for Python, so that we then sort of have small Python scripts and we can have simple scripts in Chrome via the Selenium WebDriver API, which is then also in the container. And in the end, it just tells you that the check was running or not. So it's really not as extensive as we want in terms of the output you get as it was in Sakuli in the past, but it does work for now. And if somebody has a good idea, please do let me know. Okay, so this is the end of my presentation. Okay, thank you very much, Andreas. So we're a little late already. That's why we are going to do a little change of plans. The Q&A session, which is planned on happening in room 2. So if you have any questions to Andreas, there are some questions here already. Can you see them, Andreas? Yes, I see them. I see them. Okay, because I'm going to leave now, and now you have Andreas for another 30 minutes or however long he's willing to do it, basically. And we are going to take a lunch break from 12 to 1, and at 1 p.m. we're going to continue with Maski Schulte, and he's going to tell you about how you can actually set up a good test environment for Checkmk in general. Andreas, thank you very much. And it was very, very interesting, and unfortunately I'm going to have to leave now. However, I'm going to see you again later. Okay, thank you. Bye. Okay, so I'm just going to try to go through the questions one by one. We're going to get started with the question. Where did it go? Oh, it's gone now. Whoops. Okay. Okay, Dennis Nitz is asking, do you maybe also have a calculation in terms of Azure monitoring? Talking about monthly costs. Okay, so the machine that we're using right now is causing, if I remember correctly, is causing costs of, I would say, roughly something between 80 and 120 euros a month, something like that. So it's something in the realm of that. It's been about a year, though. That's when we started it, but that's sort of the realm. So, yeah. Andreas, I'm going to support you. I'm going to help you with the questions so you can focus on answering them. Thierry asked, was the deployment by Checkmk as a container? Did you talk about that? No. No, to be honest, because in this Azure environment, it sounds silly, I know, but there aren't any containers that are being used. In this Azure environment, as far as I know, there are no normal containers. And there are only, as I mentioned earlier, there's just the database services, load balancer, and also VMs. Okay, another question by Dennis. Can the site in Azure actually be connected to an on-premises site without any problems? Yes, I can tell you that so far it's worked without any problems. It's very stable as well. So the colleagues that are sitting on-premises, they actually use their on-premise site and access the Azure site using that. And between the on-premise network and the Azure network, there is, from the on-premise network, there's a VPN connection. And the traffic to the cloud is happening without any problems, but out of the cloud, you can't do that. Okay, then Jens has a question. Can the monthly costs of the Azure VM also be a service? I don't think that was included. It's the cost monitoring that you're talking about for Azure. Something like that as is already in AWS, I think, right? But the cost monitoring, as far as I know, would be a question for Moritz, whether or not they're planning on doing that for Azure or not. The version that we've deployed, I don't remember that being there. I don't think it was included. I do think I remember that I saw it somewhere. I think I saw cost monitoring being included now. But Moritz, maybe you could tell us. Oh, yeah, he says cost monitoring is included. Okay, then it just wasn't included when I actually did it, when I first deployed it. Or another possibility could be that it was something that my client wasn't interested in because we only did everything from the technical standpoint. That's also possible. That's the cost and usage, the service, right? Dominic is asking if we have infrastructure as a service and we're using that, so VMs from Azure and application. Can you assume that in Checkmk you only have to monitor the application? Or do you then monitor also the whole host? So if you actually have the VM in Azure, so a real VM, then I'm going to monitor that as an actual host because the VM to me is also just a normal host. The application or the VM is actually doing exactly the same as a VM in ESX or Hyper-V environment. So it would just be like saying you have an ESX, you change it and you only use the data that you're getting from the vCenter, and that would be sufficient. Well, then you can also do that in Azure. That would be exactly the same. But in our case, in our scenario, we said the VMs in Azure are going to be looked at exactly the same as every other virtual machine as if they were on-premise. Ante is asking, are there any specialties when it comes to the cloud and notifications to the outside? Well, yes and no. As long as it's just the normal notification by mail, then it does work from the cloud exactly the same via the email. So if the client usually has the Office 365 in the cloud, if he is using Azure, then the emails are just being sent normally to their mail connector, as you would if it was an on-premise system that is then sending its mails to the 365 system. Anastasius has a question. I'm going to answer that question, if that's okay. For Checkmk Azure monitoring, is there also a picture? Well, if you remember Moritz's presentation from last year, he actually described Azure monitoring and how that actually works. Well, there's also Moritz's presentation from last year, there's also an explanation about the resource groups and also what the agent is requesting specifically. So it's actually going to the instance. It then says, okay, give me all the information for the following resource groups, and then you get all the information back and then evaluates it. Okay, now Michael Frank is asking, how do you do the backup? In this case, I didn't have to deal with it at all, to be honest. So if the machine is backed up, then it's being done in Azure as any other Azure VM. And in Checkmk, since there are no databases running on it, of course, it's not complicated at all in terms of snapshots and things like that of the VMs. So in Azure, you can actually create snapshots as you can with the on-premise environment. That wasn't stressful at all. Okay, I also got a link to the presentations for last year's presentations. I just posted them so you can look at them. That was the presentation on day 2. Stefan Müller is asking, I've heard of Suckly for the very first time today. What do you mean by monitoring end-to-end test? Well, end-to-end monitoring always means that you actually have your... Oh, there's another Q&A I can see. Simon is actually an expert when it comes to end-to-end testing. So we see the answer here in our chat. And that's why Simon actually developed it back then, Suckly. And it is actually a very nice tool. It used to be a very nice tool too. And we had a problem in our case because Suckly just has some limitations when it comes to HTTPS and certificates and so on. But when it comes to end-to-end testing is simply just having a check from the point of view of the user. So that means you actually simulate being a user and you try to determine how the user actually sees the application that I'm running. So that is quite important in big companies, for example, where there are SAP systems, for example, but the division that's at the other end of the world, they want to use SAP, they want to know if SAP is available and running or not. So in this case, it's quite difficult to have a test from Germany where you would say, okay, I'm just going to see if my SAP is running in Germany, but you really want to know if SAP is available in Australia that's hosted in Germany. And this is exactly what you would do with end-to-end testing. Okay, Simon Mekle, you can definitely ask him about end-to-end testing because he is definitely also building something new for end-to-end testing. So we definitely want to start something in collaboration with Simon, and we are going to do a video about that, etc. So that is definitely a very interesting topic. Yeah. Okay, Stefan's question, which is in line with this one, he said he was a little confused that he hears that in connection with Checkmk. Well, what I've done is I actually just have a Docker container with Chrome and Selenium framework, and you can then sort of manage that using Python, and then by doing that you get an output from a local check, and the local check then just says end-to-end WEM test successful or not. And I really don't have any fancy graphs or outputs or anything like that. I just get one line local check whether or not the test was successful. And I definitely think that can be expanded or worked on. And I think if you have some knowledge and you want to invest some time, you can definitely build something really nice that works like Suckly did in the past. We have a question where you could answer in English. We have Christoph. Hey, Andreas, do you have any Linux instances monitored in Oracle, DB, SAP? No, only Linux instance at the moment, the monitoring system itself. So it's only the monitoring system at the moment. And the customer mostly has Windows VMs, and the other Linux systems are in the Azure environment, but I can't access them because most database instances, if I remember correctly at least, are hosted on Linux itself, and they're hosted by Microsoft. So the normal MS SQL are also running on Linux, but you cannot access it. You only have access to the database instance. That's it. Okay, now we have the remaining questions aren't actually questions, so those are just answers by Philipp and Ralf. So Hadi Dippmann, he also gave us a presentation about end-to-end testing in 2017, so that link is also in our Q&A right now. So that's also a good resource. What's important to me is just that you notice in Azure, this whole topic of end-to-end testing is a lot more important for the simple reason that the whole infrastructure is quite abstract. So you don't see as much as you do in an on-premise environment. You see a lot less. And of course, you're going to have to use end-to-end testing in order to get proper answers in terms of what is happening with my infrastructure. And that is just a matter of getting used to, I would say. Okay. There's another question. Christoph has another question. The answer is nope. There was no problem with the agents. I don't remember having any problems with the agents, at least. The virtual machines were already migrated to Azure at that point in time when I set it up, when I set up the monitoring instance, and I only had to implement or deploy the configured agents, and we had done exactly the same that we would do in an on-premise environment. So it was almost the same, I'd say. Okay, we still have some time if you want to. You still have some time to ask questions, unless, Andreas, you just want to go get lunch. No. I said I'm only going to be there for lunch at 12:45 or something like that, so we do have some time. We can also ask him what kind of food he's going to have, but if there aren't any more questions, then, do you have any more questions? If there aren't any more questions in the next 2 to 3 minutes, I'd say we are ready to close this session, and we're going to let you have your lunch. Well, yeah, I think we've covered all the things that are interesting. So all the biggest problems we've covered, and those were just the abstraction grade being bigger in the Azure environment in comparison to on-premise environments. And theoretically, that makes it more complex in terms of the infrastructure, because you have to figure out where the root cause is of a problem, so where it really stems from. Sometimes you can't even see that. And in that case, you just have to improvise quite a lot. Okay, good. Then thank you very much. I think you can always ask Andreas if you have more questions, and he's going to be in our tech talk as well. So thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you very much for being so active as well, and always being so helpful to everybody. It's really, really cool. Thank you so much. And yeah, you're definitely very, very helpful and important in our communities. So thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch, and we'll meet back here at 1 p.m., I think. Yes, at 1 p.m. And we are talking about setting up your own Checkmk staging environment.